The wind did not howl. It was a noise beyond that. It was a solid thing, a shriek that came from a sky the color of a fresh bruise, low and heavy enough to smother the world. Across the high plains of the Wyoming Territory, the blizzard of 1883 had erased the line between earth and heaven. There was only the white, moving sideways, and the cold, a physical weight that settled deep in the lungs. Through this ghosted land, a man named Seth staggered. He was not walking, but lurching, falling forward and catching himself, over and over. Each breath was a razor. His ears were long past aching. They were numb. Brittle things he was afraid to touch, knowing the flesh would be white and hard as candle wax. His knuckles, cracked and raw from a fight hours or maybe a lifetime ago, were bleeding. The blood froze black against his skin before it could even drip. He was running, not just from the storm, but from the memory of the cattle camp, the stink of cheap whiskey in the cramped bunkhouse, the accusation, spat like tobacco juice, the sudden, stupid flare of violence. He had left his horse. He had left everything. He had left a boy named Charlie bleeding out in the snow by the cook fire, his eyes wide and surprised. Seth had not fired the shot, but he had been there, his fist drawn back, and when the chaos erupted, he had simply run. Now, the guilt was a sickness in his belly, colder than the ice forming in his beard. His body was giving out. The cold was a siren, singing him toward the warmth of sleep, the easy drift into death. He fell to his knees, the snow swallowing him to the hips. This was it. This was the end he deserved. He closed his eyes, seeing only the red stain on the white. Then, through the wall of wind, he smelled it. Wood smoke. He forced his eyes open. A smudge, a dark gray curl against the pale gray sky. So faint he thought his mind had conjured it. He got to his feet. It was not a choice. It was a last animal instinct. He put one foot in front of the other, pushing through drifts that felt like wet cement. The smoke was a hook, pulling him in. It was not a cabin. It was a mound, a half-buried sod dugout, reinforced with rough-hewn logs, its back built into a shallow rise. Snow was piled high against its walls, clinging to the crooked chimney that spat that desperate, beautiful smoke. He reached the door, a solid plank of wood, and raised his frozen hand. He did not knock. He hammered, a hollow, frantic sound that the wind tore away. He hammered until his knees buckled, and he slid down the wood, collapsing onto the small, swept patch of earth at its base. He heard a sound from within, a shifting, a long, agonizing pause. Then, the metallic scrape of a bolt being drawn. The door cracked open an inch, held by a chain. A sliver of warm, dim light cut the gloom. In the gap, he saw an eye, then a face. She was a woman, perhaps in her late 20s, though the hard life had drawn faint lines around her mouth. Her hair was pulled back so tight it seemed to pale her forehead, but it was her eyes that held him. They were intelligent, sharp, and weighed down with a haunted stillness. They were the eyes of someone who had watched the world for a very long time, expecting nothing but trouble. She looked at the half-dead thing on her doorstep. A man, rough, frozen, and bleeding. Her first instinct, clear on her face, was to slam the door and draw the bolt. This was the wilderness, and a lone woman did not invite stray men into her home. It was a rule simpler and more vital than any written law. But then she looked closer. She saw the blue-white tint of his skin, the ice clinging to his eyelashes, the way his shivering was becoming a final, shuddering tremor. He was not a threat. He was a corpse, just not quite finished. Something flickered in her face. It was not kindness. It was not pity. It was a flicker of pained recognition, one broken thing seeing another. The chain rattled as she loosened it. The door swung open. She did not speak. She did not offer a hand. She simply stepped back, and Seth tumbled inside, sprawling onto the hard-packed dirt floor. The warmth was a violent shock. It hurt. He lay there, gasping, as the ice on his clothes began to melt into puddles around him. He smelled sage and dust and the sharp tang of the fire. He heard her rebolt the door. The sound was final. He tried to push himself up, but his arms were useless. He looked up at her. She stood over him, a rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the floor. "This is not charity," she said. Her voice was low and rough, as if she did not use it often. "Ma'am," he croaked. It was all he could manage. "And it is not proper." She said this last part flatly, like a fact, as if stating the day of the week. She watched him for another long moment, then seemed to decide he was too weak to be a danger. She set the rifle against the wall, but kept it near. She moved to the stove, ladled something from a pot into a tin bowl, and brought it to him. It was a thin broth, mostly water and potatoes, but it was hot. He fumbled the spoon, his hands wooden. He ended up lifting the bowl with both hands, shaking, and drinking it down like an animal. She said nothing. She just went back to the stove, her back to him. As the life seeped back into him, slow and aching, Seth took in the room. It was one small space. Sparse did not begin to cover it. A cot in one corner, a rough-hewn table with one chair, a stone fireplace at one end, and the cast-iron cook stove where she stood. But it was not a man's space. Hanging from the rafters were bunches of dried herbs, their scent filling the air. On her cot, and folded neatly on a small chest, were quilts. They were intricate, handmade, bursting with stitching and color that seemed defiant in the gray, sparse room. And then he saw it, on a small, crude shelf near her bed. There sat a Bible. It was a large, heavy book, but it was ruined. A significant portion of its pages had been consumed by fire. The edges were blackened and curled, the leather cover scorched. It was not a book that had been saved from a fire. It was a book that had been set on fire, deliberately. It sat there not as a comfort, but as an accusation. The warmth of the broth and the fire was doing its work. The shivering subsided. The cowboy code, the instinct to not be a burden, kicked in. He gathered his legs under him, pushing himself up against the wall. He was unsteady, but he was upright. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, his voice stronger. I'll be moving on. I thank you for the soup." He shoved himself away from the wall and took 2 steps toward the door. Miriam did not turn around. She just kept stirring the pot. He put his raw hand on the latch and pulled the door open. It was as if he had opened the door to the moon. The world was gone. The wind hit him with the force of a fist, stealing his breath. The snow was not falling. It was a solid, horizontal wall of ice and air. He could not see his own hand in front of his face. To step out into that would not be walking. It would be drowning. He stood there for a second, the roaring whiteness filling his senses, the heat of the cabin pulling at his back. He was a fool. He slowly, shamefully, closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a quiet finality. He turned. She was looking at him now, her face unreadable in the dim light. "You'll freeze if you leave," she said. It was not a warning. It was a verdict. He slid his back down the wall and sat on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. "Yes, ma'am, I reckon I will." Night fell. It did not fall so much as the gray light of the storm simply thickened into blackness. The cabin shrank. The only light came from the fire in the stove. The only sound was the constant, maddening scream of the wind outside and the crackle of the logs. They did not speak. Miriam ate her own small bowl of soup, sitting on the lone chair. Seth stayed on the floor, near the hearth. She offered him a threadbare bedroll, and he took it gratefully, spreading it as far from her cot as the small room would allow. The silence was uneasy, but it was thick. It was a silence of 2 people who knew the world was a dangerous place, and words were often the most dangerous part of it. She kept her distance. She sat on her cot and began to mend a piece of cloth by the firelight, her hands quick and sure, Her back was mostly to him, a rigid line. He watched the firelight play over the room. His eyes kept drifting to the locked trunk beneath her bed. It was heavy, reinforced with iron bands. It was the only thing in the cabin, other than the door, that was secured. It was a place for secrets. He had his own, boiling in his gut, and he respected hers. He asked nothing. He lay down, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. He was exhausted, but sleep was a treacherous country. It came for him in fragments. Gunfire, sharp and deafening in the close quarters of the bunkhouse, the smell of cheap whiskey and fear, a man shouting, and Charlie, always Charlie, 19 years old, with a gap in his front teeth, always boasting about the girl he was going to marry back in Nebraska. Seth saw him fall, saw the bright, impossible red pumping out onto the fresh snow. He saw his own feet, turning, running. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering. He was sweating. Though the cabin was cool, the fire was burning low, just red embers. Across the room, Miriam was a still shape under her quilts, facing the wall. He could not tell if his noise had woken her. He lay there, breathing shallowly, listening to the wind and the ghosts in his own head. When the pale light of morning came, it revealed nothing had changed. The storm was still there, a pale, gray light at the window, the wind a constant, low moan. Miriam was already up, feeding small sticks into the cook stove. The smell of chicory, a bitter substitute for coffee, filled the room. She moved with that same quiet, self-contained purpose, as if he were not there. But he was a man, and he was a burden, and he could not stand it. He rolled up the bedroll, placing it neatly where he had found it. He stood, his joints stiff and aching, but his strength mostly returned. "Ma'am." She flinched, just slightly, at the sound of his voice in the morning quiet. She did not turn. "You got an axe," he said. It was not a question. "I saw a woodpile out the back. What's left of it, I can see to it, as repayment for the meal." She stopped moving. He saw her shoulders tense. This was a change in the rules. He was no longer just a piece of half-dead cargo. He was a man, offering to work, offering to stay. She was weighing the dwindling woodpile against the risk of him. She looked over her shoulder. Her intelligent eyes sized him up. He was gaunt, and his face was raw with windburn. But he was strong. He was a cowboy. He knew work. Then her eyes darted to her wood box by the stove. It was less than a quarter full. She turned back to the stove. Then she gave a single, sharp nod. She pointed to a heavy canvas coat hanging from a peg by the door. It was a man's coat, worn and old. The shoulders faded. "The axe is by the door. Do not stay out long. The wind will turn your lungs to glass." "Yes, ma'am." The work was a mercy. He pulled the heavy coat on. It smelled faintly of her, of sage and smoke. He stepped outside. The cold was shocking, but the wind had lessened from its shriek to a steady, powerful roar. The snow was deep, drifted high against the cabin. He found the axe, its handle smooth and worn, and waded to the woodpile. He worked with a grim, steady rhythm. The thunk of the axe splitting the frozen pine was a comfort. It was a clean sound. It was honest work. He focused on the grain of the wood, the swing of his arms, the ache in his shoulders. He worked until his beard was a mask of ice and his fingers, inside his worn gloves, were numb. He hauled an armload inside, dumping it neatly into the wood box. She nodded once, that same curt gesture. He went back out. This became their routine. The storm did not break. It settled in, a siege that lasted 1 day, then 2, then 3. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. He chopped wood. He hauled water from the snow-covered well. He repaired a loose hinge on the door. She cooked their sparse meals, thin soup, hard biscuits, boiled potatoes. They ate in silence. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the sharp, uneasy quiet of the first night. It had stretched, becoming a shared space. It was not empty. It was full of the things they did not say. He began to notice her. He watched her hands as she stitched. She was mending one of her quilts, the one with the bold colors. Her fingers were red and chapped, but they moved with a precise, quick grace. He watched her face when she thought he was not looking. She would stare at the fire, and her expression would go slack, her mouth tightening into a hard, bitter line. She looked like a woman who had been chewing on a stone for a very long time. He saw the way she flinched. One afternoon, he rose too quickly from the hearth to get more wood. He did not make a sound, but the sudden movement caught her eye. She jumped, a small, choked gasp escaping her, and her hand flew to her chest. She had a piece of firewood in her other hand, and she held it like a club for just a second before she realized. She turned away, her neck burning red, but he had seen it. This was not shyness. This was a deep, settled fear. He saw the way she read. She had 3 books on her shelf, next to the burned Bible. He saw her take one down late on the 3rd night. She read by the light of the fire, her brow furrowed, her lips moving silently. She looked hungry for the words. And he saw how she would stop, sometimes, in the middle of a simple task. She would be sweeping the floor, and her hands would still, her gaze fixing on the snow-blanketed window. Her eyes would become vast and empty, and he could feel the loneliness rolling off her. It was a cold worse than the blizzard, a desolation so complete it made his own guilt feel small and sharp. He recognized the look. It was the look of someone trapped. He was trapped by the storm. She was trapped by something much, much worse. The 5th day of the storm was the worst. The wind had found a new, high-pitched voice, a scream that set the teeth on edge. The snow had buried the cabin's lone window, plunging the room into a perpetual, gray twilight, lit only by the flickering hunger of the stove. The world had shrunk to this single 10 by 12 space, and the silence had become heavy, weighted with their shared confinement. Seth had finished every chore he could invent. He had restacked the wood. He had oiled her few, cracked pieces of harness. He sat on the floor, whittling a piece of kindling, the shavings collecting in a neat pile between his boots. He was a man built for open spaces, and the walls were pressing in on him. Miriam was at the table, her back to him, sorting dried beans. The click, click, click of them dropping into a tin bowl was the only sound besides the wind. He could not stand it anymore. He looked at her rigid back, the tight bun of her hair, the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. He had to know. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low. She did not flinch this time. She just stopped, her hand hovering over the beans. "Mr. Hawkins." She had learned his surname 2 days prior, when he had let it slip in a comment about his old ranch boss. She used it now like a small stone, something to keep distance between them. "This place," he said, gesturing with his knife at the sod walls, the low ceiling. "It is no place for anyone, let alone a woman on her own. Why are you here?" Her hand closed around a fistful of beans. He saw her knuckles turn white. "Where else would I be?" "I do not know," he said, slowly, respectfully. "Town, Laramie, maybe Cheyenne, some place with people, with light." She turned her head, just enough to look at him from the corner of her eye. Her face was pale in the firelight. "People are the reason I am here." He thought of Charlie. He thought of the fight. He knew what she meant. "Still," he pressed, gently. "This is not living. This is a burial." She turned fully then, and her eyes, those haunted, intelligent eyes, flashed with a cold fire he had not seen before. "And what do you know of living, Mr. Hawkins? You, who stumbles out of a blizzard with another man's blood on his knuckles and a ghost on his heels?" He flinched. He had not told her anything. She just knew. She saw the mark on him. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. He offered no defense. He simply waited. Her anger seemed to drain away, leaving that familiar, empty sadness. She turned back to the beans. "I sinned once," she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. The words came out flat, worn smooth by repetition. A story she had told herself 1,000 times. A sin the town could not abide. A sin my father could not forgive. She paused, and her next words were even quieter. "And I do not want to be seen anymore." He let the words settle. "I do not want to be seen anymore." It was the truest thing he had ever heard. It was an explanation for the isolated cabin, for the drawn bolt, for the way she flinched at a sudden movement. He, who was running to avoid being seen, suddenly felt a deep, aching kinship with this woman who had chosen to disappear. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say, "It will be all right." He just nodded, slowly, and went back to his whittling. The scrape, scrape, scrape of his knife was his only answer. And in his silence, in his refusal to judge or pry, the ice that held Miriam in its grip began, just slightly, to thaw. The change was not sudden. It was as slow and quiet as the growing of a tree. It began the next day, day 6 of the storm. He had come in from the barn, a small sod and plank structure barely big enough for her one bony mule, and he was covered in snow. He stamped his feet, shaking the ice from his beard, and nearly tripped over the wood box. "This mule of yours," he said, brushing snow from his shoulders. "He's got a meaner disposition than a wet cougar." She was stirring a pot of thin cornmeal mush. She did not look up. "Josiah is particular." "Particular," Seth grunted, rubbing his frozen hands together. "He tried to take a piece of my coat. I reckon he is as tired of this storm as I am." He looked at the gray, unappetizing mush. "If I had known I was going to be snowed in this long, I would have brought a side of beef." He did not expect a reply. He was mostly talking to himself, but as he turned to the fire, he heard a sound. It was a small, rusty exhale, almost a choke. He looked back. She had her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Just once. It was not a laugh, but it was the closest thing to one that Cabin had heard in years. After that, the silence became easier. She began to speak, not about herself, but about the world she inhabited. "The snow is too fine," she said one evening, listening to the wind. "It means the cold will settle in deep. It will not melt until April." "The rafters in the barn are weak," she said another time. "The last snow nearly brought them down." And he would respond, "That is good wood you have stacked. Pine, burns hot and fast. I will look at the rafters tomorrow." He offered. They ate their simple meals together at the small table. He had insisted, pulling the trunk out from under her bed to use as his own stool. "It is not right, me sitting on the floor while you are at a table." He had said. She had argued, but he was stubborn, and she finally, wearily, relented. So they sat, 2 people at a mash unit table, sharing boiled potatoes and salt pork, and she started to watch him. She watched his hands. They were rough, scarred, and cracked, but they were gentle. He fixed the broken leather strap on her trunk. He rehung the cabin door so it no longer scraped the floor. He handled her few possessions with a care that shamed her. She caught him lingering, not at her, but at the edges of her life. He would stand by the small shelf, his head tilted. He was not a reader. She could tell. He looked at her 3 books, a worn Shakespeare, a thin volume of poetry, and a primer on herbal remedies, as if they were artifacts from another world. He would sometimes trace the spine of the poetry book, but he never opened it. And she would see his eyes drift to the burned Bible. He never touched it, but she saw the question in his gaze. He was looking at the scorched, curled pages, and he was looking at her, and he was trying to make the 2 things fit. She wanted to tell him it was not her, that she had not been the one to set the fire, but she could not. The words would not come. On the 8th night, the cold was so deep it felt like it was coming up through the dirt floor. The fire in the stove was fighting a losing battle. Seth was in his bedroll, but the thin wool was no match for the freeze. He could not sleep. He was shivering, his teeth clenched to keep them from chattering. He sat up. The fire was low. Miriam was a still shape in her cot, her back to him. He needed another blanket. His eyes went to the chest at the foot of her bed. It held 2 other quilts, neatly folded. He rose, quiet as smoke, and moved toward it. He would just take the top one. He lifted it. It was heavy, and the colors were startling in the dim room. Bold reds, deep blues, and a bright, defiant yellow, all stitched together in intricate, star-like patterns. The work was so fine, so precise, it looked like something from a rich home in the East. He ran his calloused thumb over the stitching. It was made of scraps, he realized. A piece of calico from a dress, a square of blue gingham, a strip of dark wool. He turned it over in his hands. In one corner, stitched in neat, white thread, were initials, M.J. He lifted it closer to his face. It smelled of lavender and wood smoke, and something else, something clean. It smelled of her. "What are you doing?" Her voice was not a whisper. It was a blade. He froze, the quilt clutched in his hands. He turned. She was sitting bolt upright in her cot, her eyes wide and black in the shadows, fixed on the quilt. It is cold," he stammered, feeling like a thief. "I was just looking for another blanket. I did not mean to—" "Put it down." She was out of the bed in an instant, her feet bare on the frozen floor. She advanced on him, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of fear. This was not the quiet, sad woman. This was someone else. "Miriam, Put it down," she snapped. She snatched the quilt from his hands, her own trembling so badly she almost dropped it. She clutched it to her chest, as if shielding it. "That quilt," she said, her voice shaking with a terrible, raw fury, "is not for guests." The air in the room was electric. The thaw of the last few days was gone, shattered. He had crossed a line, a border he had not known was there. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it. He held his hands up, palms out. "I truly am. I did not mean no harm. I was just cold." She did not seem to hear him. She was staring at the quilt, her face a mask of grief and anger. "Just go to sleep," she whispered, her back to him. "Just stay away." She did not put the quilt back in the chest. She took it to her cot and laid it over her second shield against the night. Seth retreated to his bedroll. He did not lie down. He sat with his back against the wall, his arms wrapped around his knees. He was cold, but the shame he felt for upsetting her burned hotter than any fire. He had blundered into her most secret place. He had touched her shame. The next day, the tension was a third person in the cabin. The storm had lessened its scream to a low, mournful moan, but the air inside was thick and cold. Miriam did not speak. She did not look at him. She fed the fire. She made the cornmeal mush, and she sat at the table, her hands in her lap, staring at the wall. Seth could not bear it. He pulled on the heavy coat. "I am going to check on Josiah," he said, "and I will look at those rafters." She did not nod. He left. The barn was cold, but the air was still. It smelled of hay and the warm, animal musk of the mule. Josiah turned his head, his ears back, and huffed at the intrusion. "Easy, old man," Seth murmured. "I am in no mood for your biting." He checked the rafters. They were sagging, just as she had said. Under the weight of the snow, he would need to brace them. He was measuring a beam with his eyes when he heard it. A sound, a hitching, choked-off breath. He turned. In the darkest stall, huddled in a pile of old hay, was Miriam. She was not wailing. The outline had been right. She was crying silently, her whole body rigid as she tried to suppress it. Her shoulders shook with the effort. She had her fist pressed against her mouth, biting down on her own knuckles to keep the sobs from escaping. She had come out here, to the one place she could be alone, to grieve in the freezing cold. His heart broke. It was a clean, sharp pain, right under his ribs. He saw in her the same desolation he had felt standing over Charlie's body, the same hopeless, bottomless well of regret. A different man would have gone to her, put a hand on her shoulder, asked her what was wrong. Seth knew better. He knew this kind of pain did not want words. It did not want comfort. It just wanted to be. So he did not speak. He just walked over, his boots silent in the hay, and sat down. Not beside her, a few feet away, his back against the same stall wall. He sat. He did not look at her. He pulled a piece of hay and began to shred it. Piece by piece, he just sat there, a solid presence in the cold. He was a guard. He was a witness. He was simply there. The only sounds were the mule shifting in its stall, the wind whistling through the cracks in the planks, and the terrible, silent sound of her weeping. He sat for an hour, or maybe it was just 10 minutes. Time had stopped. Finally, the shudders subsided. She let out a long, ragged breath. She did not move for a long time. Then, she slowly got to her feet. She was covered in hay. She wiped her face on her sleeve, her back still to him. She did not say thank you. She did not say anything. She just walked out of the barn and back toward the cabin. He waited a few minutes. Then he followed. That night, the atmosphere was different again. The tension from the quilt was gone, washed away by the barn. In its place was something new, a raw, shared vulnerability. They were two people who had seen the worst of each other. They sat by the fire. He was rubbing oil into the mule's harness, his hands moving in slow, rhythmic circles. She was mending his shirt, the one he had ripped on the door latch. It was the first time she had done something for him. The fire crackled. The wind was quiet. For now. She finished her stitching. She bit the thread. She folded the shirt, but she did not give it to him. She just held it in her lap. He finished his work and set the harness aside. He stared into the fire, his mind 1,000 miles away, back at the cattle camp. He felt it before he saw it, a change in the air beside him. She reached out. Her hand, chapped and red from lye soap, moved slowly through the space between them. He watched it, as if in a dream. Her fingers, trembling just slightly, came to rest on the back of his hand. It was not a caress, it was a simple landing, skin on skin. Her hand was cold. His was warm from the fire. He froze. He did not pull away. He did not turn his hand over to grasp hers. He just let her hand rest there, a small, cold bird that had landed on him. They sat like that for a long time. "I was not always like this," she whispered. Her voice was so low. It was just breath. It was an apology, for the anger, for the fear, for the crying in the barn. He looked at her hand on his. He thought of Charlie. He thought of the man he had been 2 weeks ago. A man who could laugh, a man who was not running. "None of us were," he said, his own voice rough. Her fingers lingered for a second. A moment of impossible, fragile warmth. Then, as if realizing the boldness of her act, she pulled her hand away, retreating back into herself. She tucked her hand into her apron pocket. But the touch remained. It was a brand on his skin. Later, the cabin was dark. The fire was down to red embers, pulsing in the gloom. The cold was a living thing, pressing in from the walls. Seth was in his bedroll, but he could not sleep. He was colder than he had ever been. But it was not just the ice in the air. It was the touch. It was the sadness. He was profoundly aware of her, just 5 feet away in her cot. He could hear her breathing. It was shallow, quick. She was not asleep either. The tension in the room was unbearable. It was not desire. Not like he had known it. It was something heavier. It was the ache of two solitudes, rubbing up against each other. He felt like an intruder, a contamination. He was a wanted man, a man of violence and guilt. He was poisoning her small, sad sanctuary just by breathing her air. He could not stand it. He sat up, moving with slow, careful motions. He would go to the barn. He would sleep with the mule. It was better. It was right. He quietly pulled on his boots. He reached for the heavy canvas coat. "What are you doing?" Her voice, sharp and terrified, cut through the darkness. He stopped, his hand on the coat. I am going to the barn. I will be fine with the mule." "You are a fool," she said. Her voice was shaking. "The wind is up. It is colder than before. You will not last the night." "It is not right," he said, his back to him, his voice low and stubborn. "Me, being in here, with you, it is not proper." He heard a bitter, choked sound. It was that almost laugh from before, but this time it was filled with pain. "Proper," she whispered. "That word does not live here. That word is what burned the book. That word is what put me here." He stopped, his hand on the door latch. "You go out that door. You will freeze," she said. He hesitated. "You will freeze if you leave." This time, she whispered it. It was the same sentence from the first day. Then, it had been a fact. Now, it was a plea. He turned around. He could just make out her outline. She was sitting up in her cot, her knees drawn to her chest. "Do not," she said, so quietly he almost missed it. "Please, I do not want to be alone." He stood there, a dark shape against the door, torn. Then he heard her move, the rustle of the straw mattress. She got out of bed. He tensed. She padded, barefoot, across the cold floor. Not to him. She went to the chest. He heard her fumbling with the lid. He heard her pull something heavy out. She walked toward him. She was carrying the quilt, the M.J. quilt, the one with the bold colors, the one that was not for guests. She stopped in front of him. He was a full head taller. She looked up at his face in the dark, then down at the quilt in her arms. Her hands were shaking. She was offering him her shame, her memories. "Miriam," he breathed. "I cannot." "You will," she said. It was not a command. It was a statement of survival. She did not hand it to him. She unfolded it, gently, as if she were handling brittle glass. She wrapped it around his shoulders. The wool was soft, the stitching intricate under his fingers. It still smelled of lavender and smoke. He stood there, wrapped in her past, shaking from the cold and the intimacy of the act. She looked at him, bundled in her quilt. Then she looked at his thin bedroll on the frozen floor. Then she looked at her own narrow cot. She made a decision. She put one cold hand on his arm, her fingers gripping the quilt, and she pulled, just a gentle, insistent tug. "Come," she whispered. She did not pull him to the floor. She pulled him toward the cot, toward the only warmth in the room. He followed, his boots heavy on the dirt. He felt like a man walking in a dream. She let go of him and got into the bed, moving all the way over, her back pressing against the cold sod wall. She left a narrow space. He stood over the bed, holding the quilt around him. "Miriam," he said, his voice cracking. "It is warmer," she said, her voice small, muffled by the wall. "That is all it is. It is warmer. Lie down, Seth." He did it. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the narrow cot, on top of her blankets. He was still fully dressed, his boots on. He lay stiff as a plank, on his back, staring at the dark rafters. He was wrapped in her quilt. She was beside him, under her own blankets, her back to him. They did not touch. The cabin was silent, save for the wind. The tension was a living thing, a wire drawn taut between them. He could feel the small heat radiating from her body, even through the blankets. He squeezed his eyes shut. He felt a small shift, the rustle of the mattress. She turned, slowly. She turned onto her side, to face his back. He lay there, not breathing. Then, he felt a small, light pressure on his shoulder. He did not dare to look. She had moved. She had let her forehead, just her brow, come to rest against the rough wool of his shirt. It was the smallest touch, a touch of pure, desperate surrender. It was not desire. It was deeper. It was a surrender to the fact that she was not alone, that she had let another soul into her frozen world. He let out the breath he had been holding. He did not move. He did not put his arm around her. He did not say a word. He just lay there, rigid, while the wind howled outside. And for the first time in 8 days, the cabin was not cold. He felt the light weight of her head on his shoulder. And slowly, as the night wore on, his own shaking finally stopped. The morning broke with a strange, new quiet. The relentless shriek of the wind had finally quieted, muffled by the sheer depth of the snow. A pale, watery light filtered in, illuminating the small cabin. Seth woke first. He was stiff, still fully dressed, but he was warm. He had not slept so deeply in weeks. He was intensely aware of the small weight that was no longer on his shoulder. Miriam had shifted in the night. She was still turned toward him, her face only inches from his, her arm thrown across her own blankets. Her mouth was slack in sleep. Her brow, usually so tight with worry, was smooth. In the gray light, she looked younger and terribly vulnerable. He lay perfectly still, holding his breath. He was in a woman's bed, a woman who, the night before, had snatched a quilt from his hands in a fit of trembling rage, a woman who had cried in his presence, and a woman who had pulled him into her cot for no reason other than warmth and a fear of being alone. He had shared his guilt with no one. He had run from it, letting it fester in the cold, dark corners of his mind. But as he lay there, looking at Miriam, he felt the heavy weight of it pressed down on him. She had shown him her vulnerability. He owed her the same. He owed her the truth. He must have moved, because her eyes fluttered open. They were blurry with sleep for a second. Then they focused on his face. Panic flashed across her features, a stark, immediate terror. She stiffened, her body going rigid, her hand flying to the collar of her nightdress. She had forgotten. She had forgotten what she had done. "It is all right," Seth said, his voice a low rumble. "It is just me. Seth, you were cold." Her eyes darted around the cabin, then back to him. She was breathing quickly. I... "Nothing happened, Miriam," he said, and he used her name for the first time. "We slept, that is all." He slowly, carefully, slid off the cot, the old quilt still around his shoulders. He stood up, giving her space. Miriam watched him, her hand still at her throat. She pulled her own blankets up to her chin, her face pale. She had crossed a line in her sleep-starved desperation, and the daylight had brought the shame of it flooding back. "I will make the fire," Seth said quietly, turning his back to her, giving her the privacy to compose herself. He set about rebuilding the embers in the stove. The silence was heavier than before, thick with this new, terrifying intimacy. They did not speak for an hour. He made chicory. She dressed behind the quilt she had hung for a while privacy, and emerged, her hair pulled back, her face set in its usual guarded mask, but her hands were shaking. They sat at the small table, drinking the bitter brew. Seth put his tin cup down. "Miriam?" She looked at him, her eyes wary. "You deserve to know," he said, his voice flat. "You deserve to know who you have let into your home. It is only fair." She just waited. I am running from the law," he said. He watched her face. It did not change. She had already guessed as much. I was at a cattle camp, up on the Powder River. There was an argument about some cattle we thought were rustled. A new man, a kid. Really, Charlie, my friend, he got hot-headed. The other man, the one accused, he was faster. Seth looked down into his empty cup, seeing not the tin bottom, but the snow. Charlie was dead before he hit the ground. The other man looked at me, and I saw he was going to shoot me too. I do not know, maybe I am wrong, but I ran. I left him there, my best friend. I left him bleeding in the snow, and I ran like a coward. He closed his eyes, the guilt of physical sickness in his throat. It was a fight gone wrong, but I ran. I did not stay to tell the law. I did not stay to bury him. I just left, and I cannot face what that makes me. He had said it. He had spoken the words. He felt hollowed out. He waited for her judgment, for the fear, for her to tell him to get out. Miriam was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the low, mournful sound of the wind, which had begun to stir again. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was not cold. It was weary. "So you are a coward," she said, not as an accusation, but as a fact. "And I am a harlot." Seth looked up, shocked. "What?" "That is what they call me," she said, her gaze distant, fixed on the burned Bible. "That is what my father shouted from his own pulpit. Miriam, the sinner, the whore of Babylon, come to Laramie." She took a breath, and the story that had been poisoning her for years began to spill out. "My father is Preacher Jonas Thorne, a man who loves God more than he loves his own child. We were respected. I was his helpmeet. I ran the church socials. I played the organ." Her hands twisted in her lap. Then Judge McPherson came, an important man from Cheyenne, older, widowed. He spoke of politics, of Washington. He brought me books of poetry. He saw me. He told me I was intelligent. He told me I was beautiful. She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I was a fool. I was a lonely, stupid fool. He would visit. My father was so proud. He thought the judge might marry me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He did not want to marry me. He just wanted what he wanted, and I gave it. I thought it meant love. I thought it meant a life." She stopped. Seth waited. "I found I was with child," she said, the words wooden. "I told him. He laughed. He called me a naive girl. He said I had misunderstood his intentions. He said if I ever spoke a word of it, he would ruin me and my father. Then he rode back to Cheyenne. My father," she continued, "he saw the change in me. He beat the truth out of me. And when I told him who, he turned white. He knew he could not fight a man like the judge. It would be his word against mine. And I was already ruined." She stood up, her chair scraping on the dirt floor. She walked to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frost to look out at the wall of white. "He disowned me, publicly, from the pulpit. He made an example of me. To show his piety, to save his own position, the town, they turned. The women who had praised my needlework now crossed the street to avoid me. They threw stones at our house. They called me terrible names." "My father," she said, her voice breaking, just for a second. "He locked me in my room for the last 3 months. I was not to be seen. I was a thing of shame, an animal." She walked to the chest at the foot of her bed. She ran her hand over the lid. "He gave me scraps, leftover bits of cloth from the church sewing circle. He told me to occupy my hands and pray for my blackened soul. So I sewed." She opened the chest. She pulled out the quilt, the one with the bold colors, the one she had clutched to her chest. She held it up. It was beautiful, a masterpiece of pain. "This," she said, "was sewn during my confinement. I stitched every single sin I had committed into this cloth, every lie he told me, every time I let him touch me. I stitched my father's hatred. I stitched the town's scorn. It was all I had." Seth could not speak. He just watched her, his heart aching. "The baby," she whispered, her hands tightening on the cloth. It was a girl. She was born in that room, alone, during a storm. She did not breathe. She was born as silent as the snow. My punishment, a dead child for a dead soul." She carefully folded the quilt, her hands shaking. "My father, he could not bear the shame of me. Not even a dead baby could soften him. He owned this old line shack. He brought me out here with Josiah and a month's worth of food. He told me I was to stay, to not come back. It was not a choice. Seth, it was exile. I am here because I am not allowed anywhere else." She put the quilt back in the trunk and closed the lid. The sound was final. Seth finally found his voice. "Miriam," he said, and his own voice was thick. "Do not," she said, her back to him. "Do not say you are sorry. I am not. It is just... what is..." She had laid her soul bare. He had laid his bare. And in the cramped, cold cabin, surrounded by a world of white, two outcasts, a coward and a harlot, finally saw each other for what they were. They were just human. The storm raged for 2 more days, but it was different. They talked. They shared stories of their childhoods. He told her about breaking horses in Texas. She told him about learning to read Shakespeare from her mother before she passed. The thaw, which had started in her heart, was now complete. On the 11th day, they woke to a blinding light. The wind had stopped. The silence was absolute, profound. Seth opened the door. The sun, a thing they had not seen in nearly 2 weeks, was blazing in a brilliant blue sky. It struck the endless expanse of snow, turning the world into a field of diamonds. It was beautiful, and it was blinding. "My God," Seth breathed. The snow had drifted higher than the roof. They were completely buried. A long, sloping tunnel was the only exit from the door. Miriam came to stand beside him. She put a hand up to shield her eyes. "It is over," she whispered. "Aye," he said, "it is over." But the cabin, which had been their sanctuary, was now a wreck. The weight of the snow had done its work. The roof was groaning. Water was dripping from 3 different spots, sizzling as it hit the stove. The rafters in the barn would be in splinters. "The roof will not hold," she said, her voice hollow. "It will," Seth said, a new energy in his voice. "We will make it hold." The work gave them life. It gave them a purpose beyond just surviving. It gave them a together. He took the shovel, the only one she had, and began to dig. He dug a path out of the door tunnel. He dug a path to the barn. He climbed onto the roof, the snow so deep it was over his waist. He shoveled for hours, the wet, heavy snow cascading off the eaves. The sun was warm on his back. He felt strong. Miriam worked beside him. She could not shovel the roof, but she cleared the snow from the single window, letting the bright, true light pour in. She hauled the leaking buckets out, dumping them. She found the weak spots in the wall, where the old sod had begun to crumble. "We will need mud," she said, pointing, "and fresh sod when we can get to the ground." "We will patch it," he said, climbing down from the roof, his face red from the sun and exertion. "We will patch it all." They worked for days. The world outside began to melt, the snow shrinking, the ground reappearing in muddy patches. He fixed the rafters in the barn, bracing them with new-cut pine. He taught her how to mix mud and grass to make a strong plaster for the walls. She, in turn, showed him how to reset the stones in the loose hearth. They fell into a rhythm. It was the rhythm of a husband and a wife. They woke, they worked, they ate, they talked. And the attraction, the thing they had both ignored, the thing that had been hidden by shame and fear, began to simmer. It was there in the small, everyday moments. He was patching a leak in the roof, straddling the ridgepole. She was below, handing him a bucket of mud. Their hands brushed. His rough and muddy. Hers chapped but strong. He held her fingers for just a second longer than he should have. She looked up, her eyes wide, and she did not pull away. Another afternoon, she was at the stove, stirring a pot of stew. It was a real stew, made from a rabbit he had snared. A lock of her hair, unbound from its tight bun, fell across her face. She blew at it, annoyed. He was sitting at the table, repairing his saddlebag. He watched her, and without thinking, he got up, walked over to her, and his hand, slow and careful, reached up. He tucked the strand of hair behind her ear. She froze. The spoon stopped moving. She leaned her head into his touch, just slightly, her eyes closing. He could feel the warmth of her skin. His fingers lingered on her temple. "Miriam," he whispered. She turned her face toward him. Her eyes were dark, no longer haunted, but full of a new, frightening warmth. He was so close, he could smell the soap on her skin. She raised her own hand, her fingers soft and hesitant, and she cupped his jaw. She traced the line of his beard. He was rough, he was real, he was not a ghost, and he was not a judge. He was just Seth. She looked at his mouth. He looked at hers. He leaned in. She rose on her toes. Then the fear returned. Her eyes flashed. This was too fast. This was the same path that had led to her ruin. She dropped her hand and stepped back, turning sharply to the stove. "The stew," she said, her voice choked. It is burning." Seth let his hand fall, clenching it into a fist. He felt like a fool. He had pushed. He had presumed. "Right," he said, his voice rough. He went back to the table, his heart hammering. The next day, he was in the barn, finishing the rafters. He had left his saddlebag, the one he had been mending, on the table. He had taken his bedroll outside to air in the sun. Miriam was sweeping the floor. The cabin finally felt clean, felt like a home. She picked up his bedroll to take it back inside. As she did, a folded, damp square of paper fell from its folds. It was an old newspaper, the Cheyenne Daily Leader, weeks old. He must have had it in his pocket when he fled. She picked it up. She unfolded it, meaning to set it by the fire to dry, and her eyes caught the headline, "Shootout at Powder River Camp. 1 man dead." Her blood ran cold. She read. It described a brawl over suspected stolen cattle. It named the dead man, Charlie Preston. It said the local sheriff was searching for the other man involved in the fight, a drifter named Seth Hawkins. She sank onto the stool. He had told her the truth, but he had left a part out. It was not just a fight, it was a shootout. And he was not just running from guilt. He was wanted. A reward was posted, $50, offered by the Cattlemen's Association, for information leading to his arrest. The man she had almost kissed, the man who had slept in her bed, the man whose hair she had touched. He was a fugitive. All the old shame, all the old terror, came rushing back. She was harboring a wanted man. If the law came, if the judge ever found out, they would hang him, and they would destroy her. What was left of her? They would say she was a harlot, and now she was harboring a killer. Her father would be ruined. Truly this time, she would be sent to prison. She looked at the door. She looked at the man's coat hanging on the peg. She looked at the roof he had fixed, the walls he had patched. She carefully refolded the newspaper and set it on the table. When Seth came in for supper, the cabin was cold. The fire was low. Miriam was at the stove, her back to him, but it was the rigid, cold back from the first day. "Smells good," he said, trying to be cheerful. She did not answer. They ate in a thick, terrible silence. He tried to talk, to tell her about the rafters. She gave him one-word answers. Yes. No. Fine. He was confused. He reached across the table to touch her hand. "Miriam, what is it?" She recoiled as if he had struck her. She pulled her hand back, her eyes wide with a new, cold fear. "Do not," she whispered. That night, the air was thick with ice. He unrolled his bedroll by the fire. He looked at her. He did not know what he expected. An invitation, a word. She went to her cot. She did not look at him. She lay down and pulled the blankets up, her back to him. A rigid, unmoving line. It was a rejection clearer than any locked door. She had left him by the fire. She had put the wall back up. Seth sat by the dying embers, his heart a cold knot in his chest. What had he done? He went over the day, the moment at the stove. Had he frightened her that badly? He looked around the dark cabin. His eyes landed on the table. He saw the newspaper. It was not where he had left it. He had left it in his saddlebag. He picked it up. He opened it. He saw the headline. He understood. She was not angry. She was terrified. She had seen the reward. She had seen the words, "deadly shootout." She thought he was a killer, and she was terrified of what he had brought to her door. He looked at her, a small, still shape, pretending to be asleep. He saw that she was not just protecting herself from him. She was protecting herself from the law, from the men who would come for him. He could not stay. He could not drag her into his ruin. He had run from Charlie's body, and now he had brought that same taint here, to this one person who had shown him kindness. He looked at the door. The snow was hard-packed. The melt had begun. A man could travel. He would spare her. He owed her that much. He would leave before dawn. Seth did not sleep. He sat by the dead hearth, the newspaper folded in his lap, and listened to Miriam's shallow, false breathing from the cot. He watched the patch of gray at the window slowly, painfully, turn into the first pale, bruised light of dawn. Every instinct told him to stay. The warmth he had felt in her bed, her head on his shoulder, was the first true human comfort he had known in months. But the newspaper and the $50 reward was a stark reminder of what he was. He was a danger. He was a contamination. He had brought his trouble to her door, and if he stayed, the law would follow. He could not, would not, be the man who brought a second ruin down upon her. He waited until her breathing evened out, deepening into what he hoped was real sleep. Silently, his movements practiced and economical. He stood. He did not need light. He gathered his few things, his saddlebag, which he had repaired, his hat. He slid his knife back into the sheath on his belt. He took the heavy canvas coat from the peg, the one that smelled of her and the work they had done together. He hesitated, then left it. It was hers. He would take his chances with the cold. He rolled his bedroll, tying it with a leather thong. He did not own much. It took less than a minute. He stood by the door, his saddlebag in one hand, his bedroll in the other. He looked back at her, a dark shape, huddled under her blankets, facing the wall. He saw the proud, defiant colors of the MJ quilt draped over the foot of the cot, where she had left it. His heart felt like a cold stone in his chest. To leave was the only decent thing he had left to do. He was as quiet as a shadow. He slowly, carefully lifted the wooden latch. He eased the door open. The hinges, which he had oiled himself, made no sound. A rush of sharp, frigid morning air hit his face. The world outside was shades of blue and gray, the snow hard-packed and gleaming under a sky that promised sun. He stepped 1 foot over the threshold. "So you are leaving?" Her voice, flat and dead, cut through the silence. He froze. He turned. She was sitting up in the cot, her hair wild around her face, her eyes black pits in the gloom. She was watching him. She had been awake the whole time. "I knew it," she said, and her voice was no longer dead. It was thick with a bitterness that curdled the air. "The storm stops, and the man leaves. Just like that." Seth's hand tightened on his bag. He had wanted to spare her this. "Miriam, it is not like that." "Is it not?" she scoffed, throwing back her blankets. "You got your warm bed. You got your food, the snow clears, and you are gone. Was I not enough for you? Was I not grateful enough for the work you did?" "Stop," he said, and his own voice was soft, pained. "You know that is not it." "All I know," she said, her voice rising, "is that you are walking out that door, just like he did, just like my father did. Everyone leaves. That is the one rule, is it not?" "I am leaving to protect you," he said, the words torn from him. "I cannot drag you into my ruin. I cannot." He had said the worst possible thing. Her face, which had been twisted with bitterness, went perfectly, terribly still. "Your ruin," she repeated, her voice a whisper. She stood from the cot. She was in her thin nightdress, her feet bare. "Miriam, stay. The floor is cold." She walked toward him, one slow step after another, until she was standing right in front of him, close enough to touch. She looked at his saddlebag, then up at his face. "My ruin," she said again, her voice shaking with a cold, quiet fury he had never heard. You dare talk to me about ruin?" He stepped back, out of the doorway, into the snow. He did not want this fight, not in her home. She followed him. She did not stop at the threshold. She walked right out after him, her bare feet sinking into the hard, frozen snow. She did not flinch. She did not seem to feel the cold at all. "Miriam, get back inside! You will freeze!" he pleaded, dropping his bags. "You think I am not ruined already?" she cried, her voice breaking on the word. She gestured wildly at the cabin, at the empty, white world. "You think this tomb is a life? I am the preacher's daughter who shamed her family. I am the woman who had a child in sin. I am a ghost. Seth, there is nothing left for you to ruin." "That is not true," he shot back, his own pain rising. You are the strongest person I have ever known. But I am a wanted man. I saw the newspaper. I know you saw it. There is a reward. Men with guns will come here, looking for me." "And you think I care about that?" she shrieked, her face crumbling. "You think I care about a reward? Or the law? The law is a man in a black robe who ruined my life and then walked away. I do not care about the law." "Then what do you care about?" he yelled, desperate for her to understand. "I am trying to save you." "I do not want to be saved," she screamed, tears freezing on her face. "I just do not want to be alone anymore. Is that so hard to understand? I do not care about the reward. I do not care what you did. I cannot." Her voice cracked. She was losing. The anger was fading, and the raw, terrified wound beneath it was showing. "Miriam," he said, his voice softening, his heart breaking. He reached for her, to pull her from the snow. "Please, come inside." "No," she whispered, backing away, her whole body shaking. "You do not get it. You still see me as someone to be protected, someone proper." The fight went out of her, replaced by a desolation so total it made him ache. She wrapped her arms around herself. Her bare feet blew against the white. She looked at him, her eyes empty. "If I still had my baby," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost to the wind. If she had lived, I would not be here. I would not be this desperate, clinging thing." She took a ragged, sobbing breath. "I would not be asking a wanted man to stay in my bed." It was done. The last, most terrible truth. She had laid it at his feet. The words hit him like a physical blow. All the nobility, all his self-righteous plans to protect her, dissolved. He saw her, then he saw her fully. Not as a woman to be saved, or a woman to be desired, but as a soul who had been hollowed out, left with nothing but a desperate, aching need not to be left. She was not clinging to him, the wanted man. She was clinging to him, the first person in years who had sat with her in the dark. He saw her pain, a vast, frozen ocean of it, and his own guilt seemed small, a tiny, selfish stone. He dropped his saddlebag. He dropped his bedroll. They landed with a soft thump in the snow. He took the 2 steps that separated them. She flinched, expecting him to leave, to turn away from the ugliness of her admission. He did not turn. He put his hands on her arms, his fingers digging into the thin wool of her nightdress. He pulled her to him. "Seth," she breathed, her voice a question. Her hands pressed against his chest, as if to stop him. He looked down at her face, at the tear tracks freezing on her skin, at the mouth that had spoken such terrible, brave words. He said nothing. He bent his head and he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the soft, hesitant kiss they had almost shared by the stove. It was a kiss of pure, desperate truth. It was slow, and it was aching, and it was full of all the regret and all the longing that had filled the cabin for weeks. It was a kiss that said, "I see you." It said, "I am ruined." Too, it tasted of salt and chicory and the cold morning air. She was rigid for a second, shocked, and then, with a low, broken sound in the back of her throat, she melted. Her hands, which had been pushing him away, fisted in his shirt. She kissed him back, a raw, hungry kiss that was not about desire, but about survival. It was an anchor. It was a promise. He broke the kiss, but did not let her go. He pressed his forehead against hers. They were both shaking, their breath pluming in the air between them. "You are barefoot," he whispered, his voice rough. "I do not care. I am a wanted man. I do not care." He looked into her eyes. "I am not leaving." He bent, scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out of the snow. He kicked his bags aside and carried her back inside the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them with his heel. He did not put her down. He carried her to the cot. He laid her down and pulled the blankets over her frozen feet. She did not let go of his shirt. He looked at her. The fight was gone. The terror was gone. All that was left was a deep, quiet, frightening need. He sat on the edge of the cot. "Miriam," he started. She put one cold finger on his lips. "Do not talk," she whispered. "No more words, please." He understood. He lay down on the cot beside her, on top of the blankets, and pulled her close. She came to him without hesitation, burying her face in his neck. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she shook. He was her warmth. He was her anchor. He was there. That night, the cold returned to the cabin, but it was not the cold of the blizzard. It was the familiar, sharp cold of a Wyoming night. The fire in the stove burned low. They lay on the narrow cot, under her blankets. The small touch of the night before, the tentative resting of her head on his shoulder, had been a question. This was the answer. He kissed her again, slow and deliberate. He kissed the salt from her face. He kissed her eyelids. He kissed her mouth. She opened for him, a soft, sighing surrender. He pulled the quilt from the foot of the bed, the quilt of shame, the one with the bold colors and the stitched-in sins. He pulled it over both of them, a defiant, shared blanket. She looked at him in the dim, red light from the stove. Her eyes were clear. She was not the frightened girl from the stove. She was not the desperate woman from the snow. She was Miriam, and she was choosing. When he moved, it was with a reverence that surprised him. His rough hands, which knew only rope and leather and the haft of an axe, were gentle on her skin. This was not a taking. It was a confession. It was the final, unspoken truth. And for her, it was a reclamation. It was not the fumbling, secret shame with the judge. It was not the violence of her father's rejection. It was a choice. It was a man who had seen her at her absolute worst, her most broken, and had not run. He had stayed. He was slow. He was gentle. He was sure. And when he was finally inside her, she let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that was half pain, half release. She clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders. Afterward, in the quiet, she began to weep. It was not the silent, suppressed sobbing he had heard in the barn. It was a deep, racking, cleansing grief. She wept for her baby. She wept for her father. She wept for the girl she had been, and for the years she had lost. Seth did not speak. He did not say, "It is all right." He did not try to stop her. He just held her. He pulled the quilt of shame tight around her, and he held her, his arms strong, his presence a solid, unmoving fact. He held her as she wept herself empty, and he was still holding her when, hours later, her sobs finally quieted, and she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. In the morning, they woke to the bright, clear light of a new day. They were tangled together, her head on his chest, the quilt in a heap on the floor. They looked at each other. There was no shame. There was no regret. There was just a quiet, sober understanding. They had passed through the fire. "Well," she said, her voice rough. "Well," he replied. They made a decision. It was not spoken in grand words. It was made in the simple act of him rebuilding the fire, and her making coffee, and their hands brushing as they reached for the same cup. "If the law comes," she said, her back to him as she fried salt pork, "they come." "They come," he agreed. "And if the town finds out?" "Let them talk," he said, coming up behind her. He put his hands on her waist. She leaned back against him. "We are done hiding, Miriam." She turned in his arms. "We are done hiding," she agreed. "There is something I have to do," he said. "The ranch, where Charlie. I have to see it. I have to know." "I will come with you," she said. It was not a question. They rode Josiah, the mule, and a horse Seth had found in the barn, one her father had left and she had not had the strength or will to sell. They rode double on the horse, Miriam's arms around his waist. It took them 2 days to reach the Powder River. The land was muddy, the creek swollen with meltwater. When they got to the camp, it was gone. There was just a large, blackened square on the earth. The bunkhouse, the cook shack. All of it had been burned to the ground. The snow had melted back, revealing the charred bones of the camp. There were no bodies. There were no men. Just silence, and the smell of wet ash. "The law already came," Seth said, his voice hollow. He dismounted and walked to the spot where Charlie had fallen. There was nothing, just mud and charcoal. "It is done, Seth," Miriam said, coming to stand beside him. She put her hand in his. "Whatever happened here, it is over." He looked at the black scar on the land. He had run from this. He had carried this guilt for weeks. And it was just ash. It was gone. He let out a long breath, and the tightness in his chest, the one he had carried since the fight, finally eased. It was done. On the ride back, they stopped at a creek. The water was running high and fast, brown with mud and melted snow. Miriam dismounted. She had been carrying a bundle in front of her on the saddle. It was the quilt. The M.J. quilt. She walked to the edge of the rushing water. She held the quilt in her hands, the bold colors, the intricate stitching. She looked at it, her face unreadable. "Miriam?" Seth asked. "It was sewn during my confinement," she said, her voice quiet. "Every stitch a sin I could not undo." He walked to stand beside her. She looked from the quilt to his face. "You stayed," she said, as if it were a miracle. "You saw all of it, and you stayed." She took a breath, and with a sudden, powerful movement, she threw the quilt. It unfurled in the air, a bright, defiant flag of red and blue and yellow. It hit the water and was snatched instantly by the current. It swirled, it bobbed, and then it was dragged under, carried away by the rushing, muddy water. "It is just cloth," she said, watching it disappear. "I am not that girl anymore." Seth put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned her head against his chest. They stood there for a long time, watching the water carry her past away, until there was nothing left to see. The ride back to the cabin was quiet. The world, scrubbed clean by the blizzard and now warming under a high, pale sun, felt new. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. They returned not to a prison, but to a home. Spring came on fast, as it does in the high country. The snow did not so much melt as it was devoured by the thirsty ground. The creek, which had carried Miriam's past away, settled from a brown roar into a clear, chuckling stream. Life, which had been frozen, suddenly burst forth. They worked. It was a shared, unspoken language. Seth, his guilt from the ranch burned away to ash, threw himself into the labor. He finished bracing the barn, his axe strokes ringing clear in the morning air. He mended the weak spots in the sod walls, tamping the new earth into place with his strong hands. He built a new, solid table for the cabin, one with 2 stools, so they no longer had to eat in shifts. Miriam worked alongside him, with the shame gone. An energy she did not know she possessed flooded her. She dug. She found the small patch of earth her father had once tried to turn into a garden, and she attacked it, her hands sinking into the cold, rich mud. She planted the few, precious seeds she had saved, beans, potatoes, and some hardy greens. She scrubbed the cabin until the wooden floors shone, and the single window, cleared of its grime, let in a blinding, hopeful light. They began to make plans. The words, at first, were hesitant, spoken into the fire at night. I could build a coop," Seth said one evening, rubbing oil into his boots. "Over by the barn. We could raise chickens." Miriam, who was mending his shirt, the real one, not the one from the storm, looked up. "Chickens?" she said, as if the word was foreign. "Aye, for eggs. Maybe to sell, come summer." She smiled. It was a small, slow-spreading thing, a light that started in her eyes. "I would like that," she said. "I would like to hear a clucking sound instead of just the wind." "And maybe," he said, his voice lower, "one day we could ride into town together, not to stay, but just to go, buy real flour, maybe some coffee." Her hand stilled. Town, the place of her exile. The word still held a cold terror, but she looked at Seth, at his steady hands, at the quiet strength in his face. He was not ashamed of her. He was not ashamed to be with her. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "Maybe we could." The cabin, once a half-buried tomb, was full. It was full of the smell of baking bread, of his wood shavings, of her drying herbs. It was full of quiet conversation, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who had seen the worst of each other and had chosen to stay. The ghosts had been exorcised. They were no longer hiding. They were building. The day it happened, the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. Seth was on the roof, replacing the last of the rotted sod patches. Miriam was in her garden, her hands in the dirt. Josiah, the mule, was dozing in the new sun. It was a picture of peace so profound it felt holy. Then she heard it, the jingle of a harness, the slow, steady clop of a horse that was not theirs. She stood up slowly, wiping her muddy hands on her apron. Her heart, which had been light, turned to a cold, heavy stone. A man on a bay horse was riding up the path. He was not a drifter. He wore a heavy coat, and on his chest, gleaming in the sun, was a tin badge. "Seth!" she called out, her voice tight, strained. On the roof, Seth froze. He looked down, saw her staring, and followed her gaze. He saw the badge. He did not run. He did not hide. He just laid his shovel down, very slowly, and climbed down the ladder. The deputy reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the repaired cabin, the mule, the woman in the garden, and the man walking toward him. He was a young man, with a tired face and clear eyes. He looked like he did not enjoy his work. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." "Sir," Miriam said. She walked to stand beside Seth. Her hand found his, and she gripped it, her knuckles white. The deputy looked at Seth. His eyes narrowed, just slightly. "I know you," he said, his voice flat. "Seth Hawkins, you worked a spell with the Miller outfit 2 years back." "I did," Seth said. His voice was calm. He stood tall. He was not the man who had run from the Powder River. "Thought so," the deputy said. He sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Well, Mr. Hawkins, I am not here to cause trouble. I do not have cuffs out." Seth and Miriam looked at each other, confused. "Judge McPherson, from Laramie." The deputy said, "He wants to see you. Quietly, he sent me to fetch you." Miriam's breath caught in her chest. McPherson. The name was a slap. She felt the blood drain from her face. Seth felt her hand tremble. He squeezed it. He looked at the deputy. "What about the unpleasantness at the Powder River camp?" the deputy said, looking uncomfortable. He wants questions. Says he wants to clear the books on it. He said to tell you, no one is pressing charges. He just wants to talk. Will you come?" Seth looked at Miriam. Her face was ashen. This was it. The past, which they had buried, was here, and it had brought not just his past, but hers, too. Judge McPherson. "I will come," Seth said. "Seth, no," Miriam whispered, panic in her eyes. "It is a trap." "No," Seth said, his voice low, for her alone. "It is a reckoning, and we will face it, together, like we said." He looked at the deputy. My wife will be riding with me." The deputy looked surprised, his eyes flickering to Miriam's bare ring finger, then back to her defiant face. He just nodded. "As you wish. I will wait." The ride to Laramie was long, the silence heavy. Miriam rode Josiah, and Seth rode their horse, the deputy leading the way. Miriam, who had been exiled, was now riding back, of her own free will, to face the man who had cast her out. She was terrified. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. But every time she looked at Seth, riding steady and calm beside her, his jaw set. She found her own strength. She was not the girl he had locked in a room. She was a woman. The town, when they entered it, was a shock. It was loud and dirty and filled with people. After the profound silence of the cabin, it was an assault on the senses. And they stared. Of course they stared. They saw the deputy. They saw the rough-looking man, Seth, with his beard and his worn clothes. And they saw her. Miriam heard the whispers. A woman on the boardwalk put her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Is that? My goodness, it is. It is the preacher's daughter." And with that fugitive. What shame. What awful shame. Miriam felt the heat rise in her neck. Her first instinct was to look down, to hide her face, to pull her bonnet low. She felt the old, familiar shame wash over her, cold and sickening. Then she felt Seth's eyes on her. He was not looking at the townspeople. He was looking at her. He gave her a single, sharp nod. "We are done hiding." Miriam took a breath. She looked straight ahead. She lifted her chin. She was not a ghost. She was Miriam Thorne, and she was here. They passed the church, her father's church. Preacher Jonas Thorne himself was standing on the steps, talking to a parishioner. He looked up as the horses passed. His eyes met Miriam's. There was a moment of stunned silence. His face, which she remembered as strong and righteous, looked old. He saw her. He saw the man she was with. He saw the deputy. His face hardened, the skin pulling tight over his cheekbones. He looked at her with a cold, dead righteousness. He saw a sinner, unrepentant, riding with a criminal. He turned his back. He did not look away. He turned his entire body, deliberately, presenting his back to her, and resumed his conversation. It was a cut, a final, public severing. Miriam felt it, a sharp, cold pain. But it was not the killing blow it would have been months ago. It was just an ending. She had been his daughter. Now, she was Seth's woman. She kept her eyes forward and rode on. The deputy led them not to the jail, but to a small, neat house at the edge of town, the judge's home. "He is unwell," the deputy said, dismounting. "He is taking visitors in his study." They walked inside. The house was dark, filled with heavy furniture and the smell of polish, and something else, a sour, sick-room smell. The deputy led them to a room lined with books. A man was sitting in a large chair by a low fire, a heavy blanket pooled in his lap. It was him, Judge McPherson, but it was not the man from her memory. The man she remembered was tall, vital, with a booming voice and eyes that charmed. This man was a skeleton. He was old and frail, his skin the color of old paper. His hands, resting on the blanket, were thin and spotted, his breathing a shallow, wet rattle. He was dying. He looked up as they entered, his eyes weak but still sharp. They passed over Miriam as if she were a servant, and fixed on Seth. "Hawkins," the judge rasped. His voice was a dry whisper. "So you came. Good. Sit." Seth sat. Miriam did not. She stood by the door, her hands clenched at her sides. She was invisible to him. "You caused a lot of trouble, Hawkins," the judge said, his breath whistling. "A messy business. The Cattlemen's Association wanted you strung up. Put up $50 for you." "I did not kill him," Seth said, his voice level. "Charlie drew first." The judge waved a dismissive, skeletal hand. "I know. We found the man you fought. Name of Roper. He rode in, shot up, told the whole story before he bled out. Said the kid was drunk and stupid. Said you just ran." He coughed, a deep, painful sound. "You killed a boy who shot first," the judge whispered, his eyes on the fire. "I have buried worse, far worse." He looked back at Seth. "I am clearing my books. I am a dying man. Hawkins, I do not like loose ends. That $50 is rescinded. The charges are dropped. It was a fair fight, as far as the law is concerned." He offered Seth a deal. "I want you gone. Leave this territory. Stay away from Laramie. Stay away from my town. You go quietly. You are a free man. Do we have an accord?" Seth looked at this frail, dying man. This was the justice he had been running from. A sick old man, tidying up his paperwork. "We do," Seth said. "Good." The judge seemed to sink further into his chair, the effort of the conversation exhausting him. "Then get out." Seth stood. He had his freedom. It was that simple. He turned to Miriam. And Miriam, who had been a ghost by the door, stepped forward. "No," she said. The judge looked up, annoyed at the interruption. He squinted. Who are you? What is this?" "You know who I am," Miriam said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it cut through the dusty, sick air of the room. It was a voice he had not heard in years. The judge's eyes widened. The color drained from his already pale face. "Miriam?" he whispered. "Miriam Thorne." "Yes," she said. She walked forward until she was standing over him, blocking his view of the fire. She was no longer invisible. She was the only thing in the room. "You are clearing your books, Judge?" she said, her voice shaking, but not with fear, with rage, a righteous, cold rage. "You owe me more than silence." I do not know what you mean," he stammered, his eyes darting to Seth, to the deputy, who was standing, shocked, by the door. "You know exactly what I mean," she said. "You ruined my life to keep your name clean. You preyed on a girl. You lied. You abandoned her. And you let her father, and this whole town, name her a harlot. You let my child, your child, die in a locked room. This is slander." The judge gasped, trying to pull himself up, but he was too weak. "It is the truth," Miriam said, "and I will not be silent anymore. You are clearing your books? Then clear this one. You do not get to die a respected man while I live in exile." "What do you want?" he whispered, his eyes wide with a new, dying terror. "Not of God, of her. I want a written confession," she said, the words sharp and clean. "I want you to write down what you did, that you pursued me, that the child was yours, that I am not the sinner this town believes me to." "Never," he gasped. "My name, my legacy." "Your legacy is a lie," she spat. "You will write it, or I will. I will stand on the steps of my father's church, and I will tell every single person in this town what you did. You are dying. You have nothing left to lose, but I have a life to get back." The judge stared at her. He saw the woman she had become, the iron in her spine, the truth in her eyes. He looked at Seth, this wanted man who was standing by her side, his hand on her back, supporting her. He looked at his own, shaking, spotted hands. He hesitated. The room was silent. This was his final judgment. His name, his reputation, or this one, last single act of truth. Finally, with a sigh that seemed to drain the last of the life from him, he let his head fall back, a moment of dying guilt, as the outline had predicted, or maybe just a moment of pure, weary defeat. "Paper," he rasped, his eyes closed. "Pen." Miriam looked at the deputy. The young man, his face pale, slowly went to the desk, took a piece of paper and a pen, and brought it to the judge. The judge's hand shook. He could barely hold the pen. Miriam leaned down, her face inches from his. "Write it," she commanded. And he wrote, his hand crawling across the page, the words weak and spidery. "I, Judge Thomas McPherson, being of sound mind, do confess that I... It took him 10 minutes. When he was done, he let the pen drop from his fingers. He did not sign it. "Sign it," Miriam said. He picked up the pen, his hand shook. He signed his name, a weak, jagged scrawl. Miriam took the paper from his lap. She read it. Her face was stone. She folded it, once, and tucked it into her pocket. The judge did not look at her. He just stared into the fire. He was already gone. Miriam turned. She walked to Seth. He had watched the entire thing, his heart so full of a fierce, burning pride he thought it might burst. He took her hand. They walked out of the study. They walked past the stunned deputy. They walked out of the dark, sick house and into the bright, clean sunlight. They walked down the main street, back toward their horses. He was a freed man. She was a redeemed woman. The same people were on the boardwalk. They stared again. They saw the preacher's daughter. They saw the fugitive. But this time, they were not separate. They were hand in hand. And Miriam Thorne, her head held high, looked straight at them. She did not flinch. She did not look away. The quilt was gone, floating in a muddy creek, but her dignity, the thing they had all tried to take from her, was intact. She was walking in the bright sunlight with the man she loved, and she was, at last, free. The paper in Miriam's pocket was a thin, dry weight. It was a fact. It was an ending. But as they rode away from Laramie, side by side. She did not feel the triumph she had expected. She did not feel victorious. She felt quiet. The town, with its staring faces and whispering boardwalks, faded behind them. Her father's back, a rigid, black-coated wall of judgment, was the last thing she saw of the life she had known. And she found, to her surprise, that it no longer had the power to wound her. It was just a sad, final image. The ride home took 2 days, but it felt different from the journey there. They were not riding to a reckoning. They were returning to a life. When the small, sodden log cabin came into view, nestled in the greening valley, it was not a tomb, it was not an exile. It was the only place on earth that was theirs. Seth dismounted first, his movements no longer those of a man ready to run, but of a man weary from a long, necessary journey. He turned and lifted his hands. Miriam, instead of sliding from Josiah's back, leaned forward and placed her hands on his shoulders. He lifted her down, her body light, and he held her for just a moment, her feet dangling above the ground, his face buried in her hair. "We are home, Miriam," he whispered. "We are home," she agreed. That night, she took the paper from her pocket. The judge's confession. She read it once more by the light of the fire. The spidery, weak scrawl. The admission of his sin, not hers. Seth watched her. "What will you do with it?" She looked at the stove. She could burn it. She could let it turn to ash, just as the ranch had. But fire was for anger. Fire was for endings. This felt like something else. She folded it carefully. "I do not know," she said. It does not feel angry anymore." She put it not in the trunk of shame, but in the small tin box where she kept her seeds. The months that followed were a quiet unfolding. Summer arrived, not with the violence of the blizzard, but with a slow, building heat. The land, which had been a uniform, blinding white, exploded into 1,000 shades of green. The creek slowed, and the high plains became a sea of grass and wildflowers. Their life, which had been forged in the desperate, cramped silence of the storm, now stretched out, finding new rhythms in the sun. Seth built the chicken coop. He worked with a patient, focused energy. His axe and hammer strokes a steady percussion in the long afternoons. He salvaged lumber from the rotted, collapsed remnants of an old line shack miles up the valley. He rode their horse, pulling a travois loaded with planks, and he would return, sweaty and satisfied, to Miriam's wave. She bought the chickens. She used the last of the money her father had given her, the money she had hoarded for years, and rode Josiah to a neighboring homestead, 5 miles distant, run by a stern-faced German widow. She returned with a wooden crate tied to the mule's back, full of clucking, complaining, reddish-brown hens. The sound changed the cabin. It was no longer just the wind, or the creek, or their own voices. It was life, a fussy, demanding, simple life. The clucking and scratching was the sound of a future. Seth would stand by the coop in the evenings, just watching them, a small, private smile on his face. The garden grew. Miriam poured all the energy she had once used on shame into the earth. The soil was hard and rocky, but she fought it. She hauled water. She protected the small, tender green shoots from the heat and from the rabbits. The beans climbed the rough poles Seth had set for them. The potato plants bushed out, their leaves a dark, healthy green. She would kneel in the dirt, her hands muddy, her bonnet pushed back, and she would feel a connection to the world she had never known. She was not just on the land, she was of it. Seth built the rocking chairs. He found 2 broken, sun-baked chairs at the town dump on a supply run. He paid a man 50 cents for the wreckage. He brought them home and spent a week meticulously rebuilding them. He used strips of fresh rawhide for the seats, soaking them in the creek and stretching them taut, letting them dry to the hardness of iron. When they were done, he placed them on the small, hard-packed patch of earth in front of their door. He and Miriam sat in them as the sun went down, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. The chairs creaked with a companionable rhythm. It was the movement of permanence, of sitting, not running, of watching the world, not hiding from it. But the biggest change was inside. It was a change in Miriam. She had been tired, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that the spring work had not cured. She was nauseated in the mornings, the smell of the chicory turning her stomach. She had thought, at first, it was the strain of the town, of the confrontation. But one evening, as she was gathering the eggs, a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. She leaned against the coop, her hand on her abdomen, and she knew. The world tilted. It was not the same terror as before. It was not the sick, cold dread of the judge's child, the sin she had to hide, but it was fear, a deep, cold fear of the what if. What if this child, too? What if she was not meant for this? She told Seth that night. They were in the rocking chairs. The crickets were loud in the grass. "Seth," she said, her voice small. She could not look at him. She just watched the first stars appear. I am with child." His chair stopped creaking. The silence stretched out, filled only by the insects. She held her breath. She thought of his confession, of Charlie, of the violence he was capable of. What did a man like that know of a child? He said nothing. He just got up from his chair. She flinched, thinking he was angry, or leaving. He walked inside the cabin. She sat there, her heart turning to ice. He was rejecting her. It was too much. The fugitive and the H_R lot trying to build a normal life. It was a joke. He came back out. He was carrying something in his hands. It was a small, three-legged stool he had made, the one she'd used by the fire. He walked over to her chair, and he sat down on the stool. So he was sitting at her feet. He did not say, "Are you sure?" He did not say, "What will we do?" He just very gently laid his rough, scarred hand on her belly. His hand was so large, it covered her completely. It was warm. She looked down at him. His head was bent, his gaze fixed on his hand. On her, in the twilight. She saw his expression. It was not fear, it was not anger. It was awe, a shy, terrified, profound pride. "Well," he whispered, his voice thick, I reckon he will need a place to sleep." He started the crib the next day. He did not use the salvaged lumber. He took his axe and rode for miles, to a stand of aspen he had seen by a high stream. He cut the young, pale wood himself. He wanted it to be clean. He worked on it outside, in the sun. He was not a carpenter. He was a cowboy. His hands were clumsy with the fine work. He did not have the right tools. He used his knife to shape the spindles, whittling them one by one. He swore, often. He would throw a piece down in frustration, the wood not bending to his will. He split 2 of the posts and had to ride back to the aspen grove. Miriam would watch him from the window. She saw his frustration. She saw the intense, stubborn pride. He was building this with his own hands. He was building it for their child. This was not a secret, to be hidden in a locked room. This was a promise, being built in the bright, open sun. When it was finished, it was not beautiful. It was rough. The wood was unevenly sanded. The joints were not quite square, but it was strong. He had built it to last. He carried it inside, his face flushed with a shy pride, and placed it in the corner of the cabin, near their bed. Miriam ran her hand over the pale, smooth scraped wood. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The letter arrived in late summer. A rider from a passing freight wagon brought it. He said a preacher in Laramie had paid him 2 bits to deliver it. Miriam's hands shook as she took it. The handwriting was her father's, sharp, black, and angry, even from a distance. She stood by the new table for a long time. The letter unopened. Seth was outside, mending a harness. This was hers to face. She had not seen her father since the day in town. She had not thought of him, or she had tried not to. The sight of his handwriting brought it all back. The locked room, the pulpit, the back he had turned to her. She opened it. She was expecting a sermon, a page of condemnation, a final casting out, but the page was almost empty. There were only 5 words, written in that familiar, stark hand. "You are always my daughter." That was it. No forgiveness, no apology, no come home, just a fact. A fact he had spent years denying. She sat down, the letter rattling in her hand. She did not know what to feel. Was this his attempt at peace? Was it driven by the gossip from the judge's confession? Was he, too, a dying man, clearing his books? She cried, but they were not the tears of grief from the barn. They were not the tears of release she had shed in Seth's arms. They were tears of confusion, of a deep, old, childish ache. She had wanted her father, and he had, in his own broken way, finally acknowledged her. She showed Seth that evening. He read the 5 words. He looked at her face, at the tear tracks. "What does it mean?" she asked. "It means," Seth said, folding the letter carefully, "that he is a man, just a man. And he knows he was wrong, but he is too proud to say it." She took the letter from him. "He wants me to come back," she whispered. "He wants me to be his daughter again." Seth was quiet. He looked around the cabin, at the crib, at the 2 rocking chairs, visible through the open door, at her belly rounded under her apron. "Is that what you want?" he asked, his voice gentle. She looked at the letter. She thought of Laramie. She thought of the whispers, the staring. She thought of her father's cold, righteous house. The next day, she took the letter. She did not take the confession from the seed tin. She just took her father's letter. Seth walked with her. They walked to the creek, the same spot where she had thrown the quilt. The water was low now, moving slowly over the smooth stones. The fury of the spring melt was gone. She held the letter. She looked at the 5 words. "You are always my daughter." "He is right," she whispered. "I am." She knelt. She did not throw the letter in the water. She did not want it to float away. She wanted it to be finished. With her bare hands, she dug a small hole in the damp earth, right by the water's edge, beside the spot where the quilt had begun its journey. She placed the small, folded paper in the hole. "We are not going back," she said. She covered the letter with earth. She patted the mud down, firm and final. She was his daughter, but she was not that girl. She was Seth's wife. She was the mother of this new child. Her life was here, in this hard, beautiful, unforgiving land. She had buried the last piece of her old life. That night, the sky turned a dark, greenish black. The air became heavy and still. A storm was coming. It broke just after dark. It was not a blizzard. It was a thunderstorm, a violent, cracking, plains thunderstorm. The sky ripped open. Rain hammered the sod roof. Thunder, so loud it shook the cabin walls, rolled across the valley. Miriam, who had always been frightened of the storms, stood at the window, watching the lightning split the sky. This time, she was not afraid. The cabin was strong. The roof Seth had mended was holding. She turned. Seth was sitting on the edge of the bed. He was watching her. The cabin was lit in flashes, his face stark and shadowed. She was sewing. She had been sewing for weeks. She was making a new quilt. It was not made of angry scraps. It was made of new, clean cloth they had bought in town. It was the color of the pale blue sky after the blizzard. It was the color of the new green shoots in her garden. It was the deep, hopeful yellow of the aspens in the fall. It was a quilt of hope. Seth held out his hand. "Come here," he said. She put her sewing aside and went to him. The wind howled, a familiar shrieking sound, but it was outside. They were in... He pulled her down onto the cot, which they had widened into a real bed. He pulled her close, her back against his chest, his arm heavy and secure around her, his hand resting on their child. The cabin was dark, save for the wild, flashing light from the window. The rain beat a rhythm on the roof. She snuggled back against him, her body fitting perfectly into his. She felt him kiss the top of her head. She whispered, her voice playful, yet full of a deep, profound truth. "You will freeze if you leave." She felt him smile against her hair. He held her tighter. "I am not leaving," he answered, his voice a low, permanent rumble. "Ever." The storm raged. The sky tore open. The wind screamed. But inside the small cabin, two people held each other tight. They were no longer hiding. They were no longer running. They were just two people, battered by the past, who had found each other in a blizzard, and they were building something quiet and strong and lasting, together, beneath the roar of the Wyoming sky. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with other fans. And be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.